Well, Enel is really one of the dominant players in the sustainable energy space. So I couldn't be more delighted than to speak to the chief executive of Enel. He's Francesco Starace. Francesco, thank you so much for giving us a bit of your time. Over the years, you were really at the forefront of what now has become a huge global movement. Talk to me a little bit about how the pandemic will really change words into action. Politicians say, look, this is an opportunity to transform our economies. How sustainable will we actually become?
I think there is a mixed answer to that because the world is reacting in different ways from this standpoint. I think Europe, yes, has accelerated in the direction of renewable energy and in general in sustainable development. Other parts of the world, I'm not so sure. So we have to see what happens in the US in the next few months. We'll have to see what China finally decides, because they were going completely on a renewable direction. Then during the pandemic, we saw a little bit of retrenching on the other side. So it's a mixed response. All in all, I think the clearest signals is coming from the Eurozone, where the Green Deal was already, let's say, a big pillar of the new Commission, and the COVID-19 crisis has given the Commission additional momentum to restart from scratch, accelerating in that direction, which I think it makes sense. It's a clever move.
So I want to ask you a little bit about, you seem to say that it's accelerating the movement. So does that pandemic, is it a reset where we rethink and say we want to be more sustainable? Or was it existing trends towards more green that's just accelerated by 4 or 5 years?
I think it's existing trend that is accelerated. And if you look at it, COVID is accelerating many different transients. One is a digital transient too. I mean, this has been accelerated by COVID. So it's not something that comes up because of COVID, but this pandemic is really compressing time. It's really giving a sense of urgency to what was already something going on. And in that sense, I think it's smart to take that and then throw it into the acceleration curve, because clearly it would be a big mistake to rebuild something we knew was going to be changed anyway. So let's just do it. But like I said, this is clear in the Eurozone, not exactly clear, for example, in the US at this moment, not exactly clear in China at this moment. There is a little bit of hesitation, I think, in that sense. And here I think Europe has the potential to really play a competitive card.
Do you think that what the EU has announced was enough? I know we're still expecting some kind of common language, that would really be a game changer for companies, so that investors can look at all of the companies across the board and speak with, taxonomy with the same words.
I think what the big new concept here is that for the first time, the EU is going to go on financial markets and raise money as the EU. These funds, they come from the raising of debt of the EU, not of the single states. And to do that, the EU has to signal to the market that this is a good idea to lend money to the EU for doing these things, because a certain number of mechanisms and rules and metrics are put in place. So this is a major passage. It's a bit boring, but at the end of the day, it's what really makes a difference. Now you have a Europe that not only sets targets, but also has metrics and goes out to the market saying, lend me the money because I can do this. And I have the tools and the processes that manage this. It's completely new. This was not there a year ago. So this is a big innovation, and I think it creates a lot of momentum around what was already a very interesting development in the financial community. The sustainability finance communities is looking for something like that, which is not there, and that Europe is going to provide it in some way.
Talk to me a little bit about, Enel has actually been a regular issuer of green bonds. I think you started in 2017. How have the conversations between you and investors changed in these 3 years?
Green bonds were the first tool that you could find around the market to finance renewable energy investments and sustainable investments in general. But they were, and they still are bonds that are targeted to that investment, and that investment within a portfolio of a large series of investments. So they were dedicated to single projects. Nothing wrong with that, okay? The issue is that this is a very limiting factor when you look at the cumbersome mechanism that you have of reporting, and also it does not take into account in general the sustainability profile of the company itself. What we said is, let's look at the sustainable development goals that we have. Let's focus on those that we manage. And let's say, do you agree, financial markets, that if we meet certain sustainable development goal, the risk profile of our company is lower? And if we do agree on that, then isn't it right that because of the lower risk profile, we are entitled to a lower debt, lower financing cost of debt? And if that is the case, then that is an innovation. So we linked the reaching of a certain goal to which we committed to a certain interest rate, not on a single project, but on the company itself.
Yeah.
So we raised money as Enel, giving a commitment that we would reach a certain percentage, for example, of renewable capacity by year 21. And then we also committed to pay more in the interest if we don't reach that goal, which gave us a lot of freedom to raise money. And for the first time, did what we think is right, that is associate a lower risk profile with a lower interest rates, and therefore open up a lot of advantage for companies that want to become sustainable. And we saw that other companies are now following suit.
The way you explain it is very simple to follow. It's a little bit different to what other companies have made, and especially on the issuance of other companies, there was a question on whether actually it did anything to directly cut carbon. I mean, do you worry that some of the things in place are better than what we had before, but still not enough to actually get to the end goal?
A way to answer your question is this: the problem with green bonds is that you can be a heavy polluter and still raise green bonds, because you can have maybe one solar project and then drill the Arctic. But for that solar project, you get green bonds, which is fine. I don't have an issue with that, but I think that's a little bit a trick. So we said that is, let's say, the beginning, but not the end of the story. And I think sustainable development goals are more sophisticated and, I would say, perhaps simpler tool to use, and also discriminate more clearly those companies that have an intrinsic sustainable profile and those that maybe have less of that. So they push, and I should add, why limit that to companies? Why can't a government issue a sustainability-linked government bond? This is going to happen sooner or later, and probably Europe will be in that quite soon.
Do you think they will? I mean, I was looking at some of the numbers. I think it's like something like 4% of all bond issuance is green. How much will that increase by?
From our standpoint, we are not going to issue any more normal bonds. We are going to issue only sustainable linked bonds from now on. So as our bonding will expire, we will always have this and that. So I think there is no limit. You can basically say that as the world evolves more and more into circular and sustainable economy, it makes sense that also financial instruments are tailored to that direction. The 4% is a testimony of the limitations of the green bond, because obviously, let's assume if you are a food and agricultural industry player, how can you issue a green bond? I mean, it's complex. I mean, you really have to break your head and find some kind of green bond related activity of your own. So it is a very niche specific tool for those companies that have only renewable energy investment or can have some renewable energy products. But the world is bigger than that. So we're looking at sustainability, not just green energy. It's a little larger.
we were talking about some of, the fact that the EU came with this green plan, and you were saying maybe you were a
Yeah.
bit disappointed that other countries hadn't followed suit. If you look at politicians and what's happening, for example, with the US administration, have private companies really taken over, this vacuum, this political vacuum when it comes to sustainability left by certain parts of the world?
I think it's funny to see that during the early years of the Trump administration, when the first year and two, the administration was busy dismantling the Clean Air Act of Barack Obama and stuff like that. The companies themselves said, please don't do this, not because they like to be forced into carbon reduction, but because they had a framework. And what companies need from a policy standpoint, it's some certainty about the direction in which we're going. Then you can argue, this limit is a little bit too much, this limit is a little bit too less, but companies need to know, because we all know that carbon is a risk. As companies, we all know this is a toxic discussion to have. We want more carbon. We cannot have that. It's big risk. So we need to have some clarity on how to get there by regulators and governments. And so I think if you ask around, it will be very difficult today to find a company that says, I want to be free to fully use carbon as much as I like. Even if they think that, they understand that it is crazy to even put it in practice, because they will get into a more and more risky situation as time goes by, and companies need to avoid this. So I think, yes, companies are really now pushing governments into setting some kind of direction and rules in that space. And I think and Europe is doing it. Other parts of the world are doing it too. Like I said, uncertainty is the worst case. It is really ambiguity in this field is terrible, because it creates lack of direction, and in this phase, investors become scared.
Is there a way that you should incentivize chief executives to go further? I guess there's a timeline problem that some of the goals for carbon reduction or things like that are 30 years from now, 20 years, maybe 50 years in some case. And actually the life of a CEO is on average, I think, 9 to 10 years.
Yeah, when he's lucky. Yeah, sometimes less.
Depending on the country.
Yeah.
So how do you make sure that commitments are held?
I think intermediate steps are extremely important, because it's all about trust around the direction and the responsibility that you can discharge on the ground. So, for example, if you say, I want to take our example, we said we want to be carbon neutral by 2050, but we also said by 2030 we will have this amount of carbon per kilowatt hour, and we have this by now, so people know that on the way. And we will also report yearly what kind of curve we're following. In fact, part of my package and then the package of my reports is tied to how much carbon we reduce year on year. So there is, say, direct relationship of how much we are able to earn and how we can decarbonize the company, maintaining, of course, the profile of profitability of the company itself. I think there's many tools to do that, and investors are becoming more and more pushy in that direction. I think there are different examples of large investors, I don't want to mention names here, that write letters year on year to companies they own, saying, show me how active are you, and show me how you measure this progress, and give me examples and evidence that this is going on. So I think the financial community and the companies are going there, and I think most governments understand and do something about it, and some other governments are still a little bit hesitant. And that's a little bit what slows down the process. So I think today, of the three dimensions, companies, invest, financial community, governments, I think governments are still a little bit on the slow side.
Why do you think slow? Because they're trying to keep too many people happy, or?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of that. It's easy to criticize a government, but when you sit at the government side and you hear you're being pulled in all directions. So typically they try to mediate different forces, and like I said, it's not easy, but I think they should. And I think Europe demonstrated, you can do it, and it's not wrong. It can be done.
Francesco, to everyone listening, first of all, we have great questions, so keep on just sending those questions through. And Francesco, we got
Sure.
one question saying, how are oil and gas companies reacting to the growing green movement around the world, and how does a middleman like Enel make this transition smoother?
I think the oil and gas companies are reacting in very largely in three different spectrums of. One is the state-owned oil companies. The large state-owned oil companies. They belong to states, and they follow policies that are linked to state budget limitations. So I think they are not completely free to rule their own strategy in this. So let's take them out of the picture right now. Then you have basically two camps: the big oil and gas companies that are the US-based ones, and those that are basically on the rest of the world, and mostly Europeans. This latter part is clearly indicating that there is a rethinking of the strategy. You hear the declaration of heavy decarbonization. Some are also saying they want to become the largest electric utility in the world by year such and such. So there is a clear attempt at steering out of the oil curve itself only and go into electricity, because they see that the world energy needs are becoming increasingly electrified. So this is a vindication of our point of view that we had years ago, that electricity is going to be the medium for the future. In the US, it's a little bit more, it's different. I mean, there are oil companies that just say oil will be still needed for many, many years. And it's important that I remain efficient and I remain cost effective, and that's it. I mean, I don't need to do much about it. And of course, I will do whatever to mitigate the impact. But my business is on oil, and I am not ashamed of it. And it's something that you also have to respect. And then it's about investors when they want to change their standpoint, they can drop a share and buy another share. So to make a long story short, some companies try to become something else. So move out of what they came from and do something else. And that's not an easy transition, I should add. Others are just saying, okay, it's a mission. We have, somebody has to do this job, and we're going to be very effective and very competitive to do that. And I think we will all look at this with interest and see what happens in the future. As we are, we have a very, very large position in the renewable energy trajectory. We are today the largest investors worldwide in this field. But you have to understand, what is large today is medium size tomorrow and small size the day after tomorrow. So we are constantly increasing our ambition and our side. By November, we will issue a view of what Enel should be by 2030 dimensionally, and also from an ambition standpoint, which would be interesting. But you can understand, even if we have a world record of installation on renewables year on year, we are still 3% of the world total installed capacity. So there is an empty space that needs to be filled, and everybody is welcome to do that. And I think oil companies can play a role. I think they could.
How much do you think the renewable space will change in the next 5 to 10 years? There are questions. I mean, again, it's quite small at the moment. There are also questions about how you recycle maybe some of the solar panels when you change them. There's many questions that hopefully will evolve.
In the next 10 years, I can answer you. We see no limit to the dimension of growth in the next 10 years. We don't see any place saturating the renewable energy potential anywhere between now and 2030. We see technology keeping the evolution in terms of efficiency and cost reduction pretty steadily across these 10 years. We see increasing potential in recycling, both in the PV technology, but also in the wind technology space, which is starting to get old, if you want to use this word, in some cases. So this is an expanding universe, which is sucking in players and not compressing players into a closed space, which is kind of difficult to understand. We come from many different industrial sectors that are becoming congested. This is not the same. I mean, renewables are expanding, and even if you're growing, you think you're fantastic, you're still running at the same space. You're always 3%. No matter how hard you try, you're always 3%. It's just because the space is getting bigger and bigger. It's an incredible evolution. For the next 10 years, we see no limitation whatsoever.
When will you almost, say this is a job well done? Is there a metric that you look at? Is there, instead of the 3%,
for
is
us,
it 5%?
Look, it's funny because for us, we said that we will be cherishing the moment in which we will have more renewables than thermal generation. I remember I said this when we started Enel Green Power, say 8 or 9 years ago, and that happened a lot earlier. It happened last year, in 2019. So we had this, and oops, it happened, and all of a sudden we found ourselves there. And so now the next step is when we will be fully decarbonized. But that's going to be probably another time. Like, oops. So I think the moment is by the time in which, say, a large industrial part of the world, and I think Europe is the place, will be reaching 50, 40, 50, 60% of decarbonized energy mix. That will be a major step. That will be really a big thing. And to do that, you have to electrify transportation, and you'll have to electrify industrial consumption and buildings. It's not only electricity. You have then to use electricity that is decarbonized more and more in order to decarbonize the rest of human activities. That is the reason why we think the ambition that the Commission has thrown into the picture by 2030 makes a lot of sense. If we get to 55% by then, it's a great tool. It's a great moment.
55%. That's one of the next goals. Francesco, I have another great question from someone listening and watching us, saying you were an early proponent of green energy and sustainability. What obstacles did you face in your career, and how were you able to overcome them?
I found the major obstacle I found was the skepticism from all sides. I mean, not hostility, but just skepticism. Okay, and the only reason we were able to first of all to overcome this is that we created a very motivated and strong team to do it. I would never have done this alone. And then what we said is we used the legacy asset we had. So the cash flows coming from stuff that we knew had no more really long life in front of it, to fuel and bet on growth on stuff that people didn't understand. So we took a little bet, if you want, hedging it with the assets we had. So we said, okay, we have these power plants, thermal power plants, they're gonna be without life in the next few years because renewables are going to be competitive. No one believed that. But we said, we know it's going to be like that. So let's take the money off them and put it into this stuff, but earlier than others. And that made it, basically.
Do you meet climate deniers? There, I guess, maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like there are less in Europe than maybe in other parts of the world. But when you meet them, what kind of conversations do you have?
It's a painful conversation because they go around in circles and saying it's always been like this. The Earth is being warm before. It's not as warm as people think. What we said is, look, it's not an issue of science. It's an issue of belief. You heard all kinds of things. 10 years ago, we took a photographer, which is also an alpinist and is a climber, and we gave him a mission to go in all the parts of the world where permanent glaciers are existing. So the Karakoram, Alaska, Himalaya, the Andes, the Alps, the Caucasus, and said to him, go to the archives, take pictures of these places 100 years ago, go to the same spot in more or less the same season of the year and take the same picture and come back. And if you go on the website, which is called On the Trace of the Glaciers, you find striking testimony of what global warming is doing to the world. It took us 10 years. So now we're doing the last thing, the Alps. It's an incredible, mind-boggling experience to see 100 years ago, more or less, and now you don't even understand if it's the same place. So it's happening, and this is, then you just have to show this stuff, and then of course people deny even the evidence. I mean, let's face it, there's people that think that the Earth is flat. So it's no matter what you do, there's always someone.
Okay, on that, thank you so much, Mr. Francesco Starace. They're the chief executive of Enel, for a very spirited conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, Francine.